But today's talk is on maximizing muscle building protein meals. And emphasis on the word maximizing, or also talk about optimizing, okay? When we talk about protein, and when most people talk about protein, what's the word that you usually hear? Need. What do I need? How much protein do I need? How much do I need at a meal? And what I'm going to tell you is that in Western society, that should be the last thing you're worried about. Almost virtually everybody hits their protein need. But there's a difference between what you need, which is something to prevent deficiency, versus what is optimal for your health and body composition. What did I do? Oh, did I turn it off? See, okay, so you can't give me electronics for more than 30 seconds and I'm breaking the thing. Okay, so there are a few meal factors that influence muscle protein synthesis, which I'll denote as MPS, just because it's a little bit easier and I'll start getting tongue-tied if I say muscle protein synthesis more than one time fast. Feeding in general will increase muscle protein synthesis. So the original studies looking at, were just looking at fasting subjects. They would feed them a meal and they noticed that the rate of muscle protein synthesis went up. Makes sense, right? You make nutrients and food available. You can now have energy and building blocks to start making more tissue. Protein, carbohydrates, and fats all kind of influence it to some degree, but protein is by far the most powerful nutrient in terms of its effect on muscle protein synthesis. And I always joke around that it's tough being involved in muscle protein synthesis research because the research is actually really unimpressive. When you look at biochemistry research that's like looking at gene expression after you knock out something, you get like tenfold increases and all these impressive numbers. In muscle protein synthesis, the biggest difference you might ever get is like 30, 40%. So we get these really small differences in really small numbers, and we try to make them look impressive. And they don't look impressive, especially in papers. You see little bitty differences in our graph bars, and that's what you're going to see. But what I want you to keep in mind is that over a lifetime, these effects are cumulative, right? So if you have a 5% difference in a rate of muscle protein synthesis at every meal over the course of your life, that will lead to a significant difference in the amount of muscle mass you might carry, or how healthy that muscle mass is. So even though it might seem like a small difference, it is cumulative. So if we're looking at trying to optimize body composition, muscle mass, then maximizing the rate of each meal is important. And I'll get people who say, Layne, that's great, but I don't want to look like a bodybuilder. I don't want to look like a bodybuilder. I don't care to look like a bodybuilder. And that's fine. You're not going to look like a bodybuilder or muscle bound. And trust me, I've tried to spend 15 years to look too big. And in a suit, I just basically look like a guy who kind of lifts, you know? So it's nothing where you're going to, you know, protein isn't going to make you massive. But, you know, putting on a little bit more muscle over time, creating healthier muscle through more protein turnover. Muscle is, I was telling a couple of you guys, muscle is a lot like bone. You get an accretion of it throughout your young years and growing years into your adulthood, and then you reach a peak, and then it starts to decline. And we always worry about bone mass because, you know, somebody who's 70, 80 years old, we don't want them to fall and break a hip. Well, what I would submit to you is if they didn't fall in the first place, they wouldn't have to worry about breaking their hip. If they had more muscle, they could prevent that. When you have more muscle, you are more mobile. There was a review done by Robert Wolf, and he looked at causes of death after age 65. And I don't know I forget the exact statistics, but basically he was able to tie around 2/3 of all deaths after age 65 to some sort of muscle dysfunction, okay? So people, unfortunately, muscle gets a bad rap because we think about muscle, and when you got a bodybuilder up here talking to you, you think, okay, well, that's just a vanity thing. When in reality, it's very much a health thing. So let's talk about protein's influence on muscle protein synthesis. It's by far the most impactful nutrient, so no drama there, no great revealing, but meals without sufficient protein don't stimulate muscle protein synthesis. So if you have a meal that's just carbohydrates and fats, and you gave that, you would not see an increase in muscle protein synthesis. You need a certain amount of protein to hit that threshold in order to cause a response, okay? And the quality and the quantity of the meal is important, okay? We're going to get to that. So I want to bring this up because, well, getting back to the whole need versus what is optimal, okay? The government right now bases its recommendations on basically what we need. I always find it funny because with carbs and fats, it's always, okay, how much can we get away with? How much can we have, you know? Whereas protein, it's like, what's the minimum we need? And actually, that's kind of an animal science type thought, you know, because protein is the most expensive nutrient. Well, what's the minimum we need to get some growth? Well, most of us aren't worried about that. We're worried about optimal. So to determine like amino acid requirements, protein requirements, one of the ways they can determine this is through a method called direct amino acid oxidation, okay? So they feed increasing levels of a test amino acid. Pick your amino acid. We'll just say, oh, I don't know, leucine. And they look at the rate of oxidation here on the y-axis. And what you find is you basically have a flat rate of oxidation until you hit a certain inflection point where you get a sharp increase in the rate of oxidation. So the idea they say is that when you start getting increased oxidation of that particular amino acid, it's being wasted, that it's being used for energy, so you don't need any more than this, because at this point you start to get real sharp increases in plasma amino acid, and that causes an increase in oxidation. But this type of thinking ignores the metabolic effects of amino acid on protein metabolism. The first thing I said when I saw one of these graphs was, well, who cares if it's oxidized if it still has a signaling effect, if there's still a metabolic effect? They're thinking about amino acids purely from a substrate level, okay? Which is true. You do need amino acids as building blocks for new proteins, for new muscle protein. I had an RD say to me one time, well, you really only need 5 or 10 extra grams of protein per day because that's all you can deposit in muscle per day. And that's true. Even at the maximum rate of protein synthesis, the most amino acids you'll really deposit in muscle per day is 10 grams. But you're assuming that you've already maximized the rate of muscle protein synthesis. To maximize the rate of muscle protein synthesis is a completely different animal, okay? So it's ignoring a metabolic effect. Now, I'm going to quiz you all on this graph. Just kidding. This graph was my life for 6 years. So, but this is just a basic, quick, you know, we're talking about leucine and protein, and I'm going to tie all this together. But if we're talking about metabolic effects of leucine, leucine has an interesting and unique effect on muscle protein synthesis. Leucine stimulates a kinase called mTOR. Okay, it's mammalian target of rapamycin. Say that 5 times fast and see how it feels. And mTOR, in turn, stimulates these initiation factors X6K and 4-EBP1. And those, by phosphorylating those, basically that causes increases in muscle protein synthesis. Okay? Energy also has an input into this pathway through insulin. You know, if you have more energy, you're going to have a little bit higher insulin level. And AMP kinase. So AMP kinase senses low energy levels in the cell. So if you have a low energy level, low ATP level, AMP kinase actually blocks this activity. It'll block the stimulation of mTOR, which makes sense from a teleological perspective when you think about protein synthesis is metabolically expensive. So it costs you ATP to make protein. It costs you energy to make protein. So if you're in a low energy state from a survival standpoint, you don't want to be making a whole lot of protein that's costing you energy that you can't maintain. So that's why energy has an input.
So Layne?
Yes?
With this graph, so when you see an arrow going to
Oh, I'm sorry.
meaning that it stimulates, right?
Right, correct. So if there's an arrow, and this dotted line means we don't exactly know how it does it. I could do a whole nother thesis on that. And then the bars here means it blocks an activity.
So do you mind if, like, you know, we stop you during your presentation?
No, I don't mind at all. I should have said that right after. I like to do presentations informal, so I don't want people to not understand something and then maybe get behind a little bit. So please, if there's something that you're not clear about, stop me during the presentation. I like to just have a conversation, okay? I don't want to just talk at you guys. So if you have any questions, please let me know during the presentation. So but basically, this big fancy graph just saying, yeah, leucine will stimulate muscle protein synthesis. So and actually, it is really the only amino acid that stimulates protein synthesis. There's a little bit of debate whether isoleucine does it to a small extent. But based on the literature I've seen, leucine is really the only one that does it to a significant extent.
So you need only one of
all the amino acids that stimulates muscle protein synthesis, yep. There's some data that suggests maybe isoleucine stimulates part of that pathway. There was some data showing it modestly increased mTOR activity, but they didn't show an increase in muscle protein synthesis. So
not just the branch chains, but all of them.
Yes, and actually this is what I'm showing right here. So this is a study from Peter Garlick, okay? So he basically, I'm not showing a graph that's also in this study because I couldn't fit it on the same slide and it would get cluttered. But basically he said, okay, well let's try and identify, amino acids that stimulate muscle protein synthesis. So he looked at the whole spectrum of amino acids and then broke them into non-essential and essential and found that the non-essential did nothing and the essential stimulated muscle protein synthesis, the same as a complete mixture. So then he took the essentials and broke them into branched chain amino acids and non-branched chain amino acids. And he found that the non-branched chain amino acids did not stimulate muscle protein synthesis, whereas the branched chains did. Then he further took the branched chains and broke them down into the individual branched chains. And so this right here is just a sham, so this is a placebo right here. Then you have branched chain amino acids given to these subjects, then leucine alone, valine alone, or isoleucine. And as you can see, leucine was the only one that increased muscle protein synthesis to the same extent as the complete branched chain mixture. Hence, the effects of muscle protein synthesis are on leucine. And again, I always don't know, it's not just enough to know, I want to know why. And so Dr. Layman and I actually talked a lot about why would the body kind of develop to sense one amino acid, okay, instead of just sensing all of them? Well, one, it'd be energetically expensive to have complexes that sense for all of them. And two, if you were going to pick one amino acid to be representative of the diet, typically if you look at the leucine content of a protein, it is very reflective of the total essential amino acid content of that protein, okay? So very reflective of that protein's quality. And further, leucine is its passage across the cell membrane is pretty passive, so it's on a concentration gradient. So it's going to be getting into the cell according to the concentrations. So that kind of makes sense. And then also, you would also want an amino acid that's not extracted in a large part by the gut. Okay, the gut and the liver chew up a lot of amino acids during digestion. But leucine is one amino acid that they don't really touch. Leucine basically reaches your plasma and your blood in quantitative values. So our theory would be that the body selected leucine because it's so reflective of what's in the diet. And instead of it sensing all the amino acids, it senses leucine. And says, okay, if leucine's good, everything else must be good too. And these effects are very closely tied to increasing blood concentrations of leucine. So to get this effect, you have to get an increase in your plasma levels of leucine. So after you eat a meal, if it has enough leucine, your plasma levels of leucine will go up and you will get this response. If you eat a small meal and it has a little bit of protein but not enough leucine to actually increase plasma leucine, you won't get this response. And we're going to get into that a little bit further. So we came up with the idea of this leucine threshold. And I kind of just alluded to it a minute ago, that there's a specific amount of leucine that you need to get at a meal in order to increase plasma leucine, thus increasing muscle protein synthesis. So we wanted to construct a study to test this, and we said, because before I got to Illinois, most of the studies on leucine were just in purified solutions. They weren't actually in complete proteins. So we wanted to look at, okay, let's compare several different proteins at the same total protein intake. Okay, so it's completely but with the same total protein. And so this is, we fed rats either, we adapted them on diets of either wheat, soy, egg, or whey. And then after 2 weeks of adapting them to that diet, and that's actually an important point, we always adapted our animals. A lot of studies, they will take an animal, they get fresh from the animal farm or wherever, and they will just throw them on some diet. Animals are extremely sensitive to stress and changes, and if you just throw something new at them, you don't know if you're getting a response or if it's a stress response. So we adapted them to these diets so they would actually be used to them. And then we fed them a breakfast meal with these different with the meals they were used to. So they were just getting their normal breakfast meal, and we looked at the rates of muscle protein synthesis and plasma leucine afterwards. So this is plasma leucine. So as you can see, there was no increase in plasma leucine in the group fed wheat, no increase in the group fed soy. You get a big increase in the group fed egg and a bigger increase in the group fed whey. And actually, does that look familiar to you guys? Do you guys remember the graph of direct amino acid oxidation? So that looks almost identical, right? So you're getting an increase in plasma levels of leucine, and actually you're getting an increase in oxidation. Well, that by current definitions of protein need, that would be considered a wasteful amount of protein. Well, that wasteful amount of protein is the only amount of protein that actually stimulates muscle protein synthesis post-meal, okay? So you can see over here, these are the rates of muscle protein synthesis after the meal. There was no difference between baseline and wheat or soy, but there was a significant difference between baseline and egg, and a significant difference between baseline and whey, okay? And it was closely associated with the plasma levels of egg and whey. Now what's really interesting is that the difference between the leucine content between soy and egg is only 10%, okay? So only a 10% difference, but there was almost an 80% difference in the plasma leucine response. So that says to us that there really is a defined threshold that you have to hit, that you basically get to a certain point and there's an inflection, there's a large spillover into the plasma. So if you're below that threshold, I mean, you may be, if it's in humans, if it's 10, 12 grams, you may be very close to it, but if you don't hit it, you might not get anything in response. So it's not a linear relationship between leucine intake and muscle protein synthesis. It's not like you eat 10 grams of protein and you're getting half the response as you would with 20 grams. It's not like that. So when we translate these numbers into humans, and there has been some human research done after that, this basically, the leucine threshold looks like it's about 2 to 3 grams of leucine required to maximize muscle protein synthesis. Now, Nin asked me the other night, well, what about, somebody, does weight have a difference? Yes, a lot of factors play into that. But I'm giving you numbers that I'm comfortable. If I say 3 grams of leucine, I am comfortable that is going to maximize this response for 99.9% of people, okay? 2 grams is probably going to do it for most people. But if I'm talking about athletes, or I'm talking about strength trainers, or people who are really interested in optimizing their performance, optimizing their muscle mass, I say, well, more isn't going to hurt you. So 3 grams. And higher quality protein sources with more leucine will require less total protein. Okay, this is important, and this is a point a lot of people miss. So if you get any source of protein high enough, you can hit this threshold. And that's how some of the data has been misinterpreted. There was actually a study that showed that soy was just as good as whey. I remember this study, and that was all the responses we got from our paper. I said, well, if you look at that study, they had almost 30 or 40% greater amount of total protein in their study, and they showed a significant increase in plasma leucine in response to the soy group. This is different. So the lower you go in protein, the more critical the source of protein you choose. So that especially becomes important with people like vegetarians, elderly who don't like to chew a lot of meat, those sorts of things. It becomes very, very important. So obviously the reverse is also true. Lower quality protein sources with less leucine require more total protein. And just to give you an idea, if you're talking about something like wheat, which I would consider an extremely low quality protein source, to get that 3 grams of leucine, you might need 44 grams of protein. Whereas something like, well, I will say traditional whey isolate, you may need 27 grams, but with, she was telling me that BiPro is actually 13% leucine. So you would need more like 22 or 23 grams to hit this response, which is really, really impressive. Okay, in the shameless plug, right? No, but in all seriousness, that is very impressive and very important because you can choose a lower leucine source of protein, but now if you want to get the same response, you have to choose to consume more. And my advisor, Dr. Layman, I remember when the high protein cereals came out. Dr. Layman was just, he was livid. He's like, do people actually buy this crap? He said, it says high protein. It's 9 grams of wheat protein. It's not going to do anything, and it's because of this. It's like, okay, 9 grams of wheat protein, don't think you're quite hitting the threshold, But they can say high protein because it's almost 3 times the amount of protein that's normally in cereal. But that doesn't mean it's effective protein.